Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is the case of Lucas Leonard. This was a suggested case. It was suggested by Zoom, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have. Lucas Leonard was born in 1996. Two parents, Bruce and Deborah, and they lived in Chadwick, New York. He was 19 years old when he was brutally murdered, and it was just 3 weeks away from his 20th birthday. I'd just like to let you know, I mean no disrespect whatsoever to anyone I talk about. I've gathered this information from the internet and compiled it into a video for educational purposes. On the 12th of October in 2015, Lucas was rushed to the hospital by his family in a white van. Now, the initial thoughts of the medics was that he'd actually been shot. He had all this blood pouring down one side of his leg, and they thought that he'd been shot in the genitals. The doctors, of course, were trying to perform life-saving measures, but they quickly realised that Lucas had already passed away. They also realised that he had been like that for some time, and then at 12:28 p.m, they pronounced him as dead. When the autopsy was performed, they were looking for a bullet. Like I said, they thought he'd been shot. They thought that possibly he'd been shot somewhere else and that it may be ricocheted around his body or something like that. The autopsy found a 3/4 inch laceration on his penis, and it actually went through the skin and to the tissue beneath. And there was also extensive bleeding and bruising all throughout his body, and it went so deep that it went all through the tissues and actually into the muscle. That's how badly he was bruised. The amount of blood that he actually lost brought on dehydration, and when they looked to find this bullet, they didn't find one. He hadn't actually been shot. His cause of death was actually due to trauma. As I said, his family were the ones that brought him in, so of course they were brought to one side and questioned. They were also told that Lucas didn't make it, and they were all very distraught over it. But that was when they stopped becoming cooperative and they just really didn't say anything. Like, they thought it was gang related. They wanted to know what had gone on. They just didn't have a clue. And they wanted the parents to give the insight, and they just were shutting down. They weren't saying anything. That was when they took Debbie, his mother, into like a side room and spoke to her to see whether they could get anything out of her. She said that they went to church at 9 p.m. and that was the last she'd seen of him. This church was the Word of Life Christian Church. And so the authorities went around to this area because that was where the mother last saw him. They obviously wanted to see what had gone on. So they went around looking around this church, and then that was when they found another badly beaten young man. This man was Christopher Leonard, and it was Lucas's 17-year-old brother. He was almost at the point of death when they found him. He was like within inches of it. He was so badly beaten and things like that himself. And of course they rushed him to St. Elizabeth Hospital. This was kind of when things started falling into place, and the police discovered that all this did actually happen inside the church. The Word of Life Christian Church began its life as a normal Pentecostal church before it was taken over by a new pastor, and, well, let's just say its means drastically changed. At the time of these actual events, it was like this small sanctuary and there was only 18 members. The building that they were actually in was huge. It was like this old school, but I will tell you a little bit more about that later on. So as the team worked on Christopher, they found out the extent of his injuries. He was covered in bruises with all these cuts all over his back. His entire body was in pain. His face was swollen. Oh, it was so bad. The main areas that were the most swollen were his nose, his chest, his genitals and his thighs. He also had some internal bleeding, and he lost a lot of blood due to this as well. The doctor actually likened his injuries to someone being pinned under a car for hours and receiving these crush injuries. That's just how bad it was, just to give you a picture of the state that he was in. And it's quite unbelievable to think that after being in such a state that this all happened in a church. Like, what on earth was going on inside this church for Christopher to be in that state and Lucas to have lost his life? Let me tell you a little bit about the pastor that ran the church. It's a very important aspect of the case to figure out the motive behind the attacks on these innocent boys and Lucas unfortunately losing his life. The head of the church was called Jerry Irwin. He was born on the 22nd of April in 1957. And growing up, he didn't have a good childhood. His family abused him. They never showed him affection. They would beat him and things like that. He suffered a fair bit as a child. He ended up with low esteem and fear of rejection sort of coming from that. He got older, he met a girl, he married her. She left him. He then turned to drink. He would get sort of blackout drunk all the time. On one occasion, he actually tried to commit suicide. And then he had this encounter with God. And from that moment on, he swore that he would do everything he could to help others, which is just a load of garbage. You'll see why as I go through it. So Jerry would claim that he had this direct line to God. So whatever, literally God was up there speaking down to him and telling Jerry what to do. And that is what he would tell his members. And Jerry was very much a man that needed to be in control. Literally at all times. He'd preach to everyone that God was telling him to do something, telling him to tell them to do something, and they'd just do it, sort of blindly. They thought he had a direct line to God. He kind of brainwashed them, building up their trust of him and then bending them to his will. And I'm not going to lie, he basically formed a cult. Neighbours outside of the church described it as being very isolated, and they did actually describe it as a cult themselves. They knew what it was, even though the members would deny it regardless. One neighbour actually commented saying that they used to build fires on the roofs and then they would do these weird rituals and they would hear this strange chanting from it. A former member of the church said that parents were routinely encouraged to beat their children if they got bad grades, if they didn't do their homework on time, literally anything. He would tell them that they had to beat their children, and they would do, because obviously that was what God was telling them. It was really bad. Like, he could control people's marital lives. There was this one occasion he spoke to this woman, I believe she was 19 actually, and she had a husband outside of the cult. Now she was inside of the cult. He told her that God wanted her to divorce her husband and then marry somebody that was actually in the cult. And she did it. She divorced him and she married this cult member. As I said before, the building they were in was huge. They had kind of done lots of modifications on it, and they had like converted the old school gym into this sanctuary. And of course they had defectors from the cult. There's only so much, in a sense, that people can put up with, you asking them to beat their children and things like that. And they would have a lot of defectors, and normally cults and things do actually want to silence those. They don't want them to speak out about it. They don't want to let anybody on the outside know what's going on in their walls. They would just cocoon everyone inside, like the children were homeschooled and things like that. They weren't allowed out. So they just had their cult and they had no outside influence whatsoever. And of course, if anyone left, they didn't want them to say anything. There were initially 80 members to this cult, but a lot of people left, 62 people to be exact, in the end. And who can blame them? They were putting everything they had into this church, and they were getting told what they could and couldn't do. There was a lot of talk of demons, so you weren't allowed to watch TV because it was letting the demons in. You weren't allowed to go on the internet because on the internet there are things that are of sexual nature, and that's letting the demons in. So you weren't allowed to do anything. As you can imagine, the church needed money to survive, and the people living in there, as I said, would just give everything they had towards it. All of their wages, literally everything. They just hand it all over without even a second thought. Jerry would say things like, I need this luxury apartment building for my family, and they'd all pull together, gather the money up and get it done because they thought it was God's will. This apartment was built on the 3rd floor of the building, and it had a basketball court, it had a spa, and it had a hot tub, and it was all built with the church's money that the members had gathered together. These people were just so brainwashed. So for example, Bruce, which was Lucas and Christopher's father, was even trading in his food stamps for the church every month. So, like I said, lots of members left and they were down so many members that they had to find alternate means of making money, which they did. They did so by turning the second floor into a puppy mill. Which is just horrendous. They're awful things. The puppies and whatnot are often inbred, or they're just treated so badly. They have so many things wrong with them. It's just horrible. But obviously they didn't care, so they just did it for the money. Not only that, they sold exotic birds, things like African greys and things like that. And at times they would have over 100 animals in the building, along with pets that they had of their own. And the members would all look after them. They would be the ones in charge to look after them. They were totally dedicated to this cult because in their mind, and Jerry had kind of enforced it many, many times, it was a direct line from God. That was exactly what he wanted. And if they left, so especially the remaining 18, because they totally stuck to it, if they left, they would be going to hell because they now wouldn't have the direct line to God, and that's not acceptable. And that would lead to them going to hell. That's what they believed, and that's why they stayed. They were completely and utterly brainwashed. Now we get around to 2012 when Jerry is becoming ill. He was quite a big guy and he suffered from a few different medical problems, one of which was diabetes. And he never really took very much care of his body. So the more weight you put on, your arteries and stuff clog up and it's just really unhealthy. It can lead to heart attacks and strokes and whatever else. And it did eventually for Jerry. The thing with becoming ill though, Jerry had always said to his members that it was demons inside here. That you invited them in, you'd done something wrong that wasn't permitted, you'd invited these demons in, they made you ill, and you had to deal with them. You had to get rid of them because it was your fault. And not that you were suffering from a cold or anything like that, they were demons. You invited these demons in, doing something that you shouldn't have, like maybe watching TV, going on the internet, or hell, even having sex. All of those things you weren't really allowed to do had given you these demons and you'd invite them in. Well, now Jerry was having medical issues. Who let your demons in, Jerry? Because you said that illness is demons. So what did you do wrong to let these demons in? Or did somebody else invite your demons in for you? Is that what you would have come up with? In 2014, Jerry had a stroke. And it was fatal, essentially. It didn't kill him straight away, but he was pretty much dying after that. It would cause so many more problems for him. He was just on his deathbed. They tried to hide it initially from the church, but I mean, he was the pastor, he was there at the forefront all the time, and now suddenly he's not there. People knew something was going on. And this was when his daughter Tiffany kind of took up the mantle. They eventually told the members that he was poorly and that God wanted them to gather all this money to pay for all of his medical bills to try and help him survive. And so they did. They gathered, I believe, around $30,000 to pay for his medical expenses, and they ended up buying him a hyperbaric oxygen chamber to try and make him well again. It cost them a lot of money and he died inside of it. His wife Tracy found him inside of it, obviously dead. And what would you think that she did? So normally you'd call an ambulance, you'd call the police, somebody to come and get your husband to maybe try and revive him. No, she didn't do that. She got two sons who were kind of bodyguards for the church. They were kind of these big guys. She got two sons. She bundled this hyperbaric chamber with the body into the van. And they drove for 18 hours to Missouri to go and see a faith healer. This faith healer was called Mel Bond. She wanted him to raise her husband from the dead. As you can imagine, well, of course it wouldn't have worked, but they didn't even get that far. As soon as they got there, Mel turned them back around and off they went, driving the 18 hours all the way back home. So they put the chamber in the church and they had all of the members pray for his resurrection for around 3 days, I believe. And on the third day, Tracy said, "I see a tear forming." And then one of the members that was an ex-nurse proceeded to tell them that it was actually decomposition. So unfortunately their prayers didn't perform this miracle. Anyway, Tiffany, who then took over fully, She was 27 at the time, and it had been something that she wanted to do for so long, and she failed miserably. She was like the worst. I mean, he was bad, but not to her extent. She took it over when she was 27, and by the age of 29, she was in jail. Tiffany heard voices. She felt like they were coming from Satan, and she had this huge fear of men. She literally thought that every single man around her wanted to have sex with her. And not only that, of course, she also had a direct line to God. It must be something that's passed down in the genes. She had it too. Please don't get me wrong, I'm not mocking religion or anything like that, but these people would nut jobs, and you'll find out why. It would seem that Tiffany was actually attracted to Lucas. She would say that he was the devil because she had these feelings for him. I guess in her eyes, she felt like he was making her feel like that. I don't know. Anyway, she'd have these dreams about him over and over, and they would do things to her, and she would blame that on him too. She would say that it's his sorcery, and she'd apologise to Jesus for it. Lucas and Christopher actually had a stepsister called Sarah Ferguson, who had 2 young children, and she accused Lucas and Christopher of molesting them. Now let me just put in, the children were examined after all this had happened, and there was no evidence of any trauma whatsoever. So these boys had done nothing to these kids. Where this came from, I have no idea. Why she just ran, whether she had something against them, I don't know. She said it anyway. Later on, you'll find out that the boys admitted to it, but they didn't do it. It was to stop the incessant assault on them. So I just wanted to put that in there because there was no evidence found that they'd actually done that. So she'd either hallucinated it or just completely made it up, I guess. Now this brings me back to that fateful day. So what actually happened to these boys was, it was around 9 p.m. and they were having a counselling session. She told the Leonard family that she wanted them to stay behind after it had finished. The boys were stood getting barraged by Tiffany and their own parents and the other members. She was saying that there are demons in them and we're not going to stop until they're exorcised. At around 10 p.m. she told the others that they could leave, but she wanted the Leonard family to stay, like I said. One of Tiffany's brothers, Joe, grabbed Christopher and he punched him in the stomach a few times. And his family stood there and watched it. Bruce stood there and watched it all. So he stood there watching his son get beaten up, and he incredibly says to him, if he doesn't answer you, hit him again. What happened that night was just pure evil, and there's no other way that I can put it. Not only did the family watch, they partook in it too, with their sister Sarah doing the most damage. Joe punched him again. This was when another member, Linda Morey, began punching him in the face, and that's when Deborah joined him. She began punching her own son in the face, his own mother. She tells them to confess their sins. Lucas, by this point, was also getting beaten up. He had already admitted to molesting the kids, which he didn't do, but he just wanted it to stop. He thought that if he admitted it, I guess, they would stop, but they didn't. So Christopher followed in his brother's footsteps, and he admitted to it too. These beatings lasted hours, and there were even points where, they would, I guess, splatter the blood on the wall or get the blood on the wall, and they were made to clean it up. They were given cleaning products, and they were made to clean up their own blood off the wall after being badly beaten for hours on end. Linda actually got the electrical cord from the closet. Bruce began whipping both of the boys over and over and over. The boys admitted to all kinds of rubbish that they just pretty much made up on the spot to try and end this madness, but none of it worked. That was when Sarah got the electrical cord, and the other people had been using the plastic end of it, I guess where it plugged into a monitor or something like that. She decided that she was gonna use the plug end with the 2 prongs on, and she was gonna start whipping them with that, which is just horrific. She also aimed it at their groins, and then one fatal hit did cause the pool of blood to spew out, pour down Lucas's jean leg, all into his shoe, his sock. And Linda went up to him and she simply mocked him, saying that he'd peed himself. Which of course it wasn't, it was blood. And that he wasn't so tough now. At around 5 hours into this horrendous 9-hour brutal beating, Sarah was screaming at them to get off the floor. As you can imagine, after suffering 5 hours of being absolutely battered, they're going to be falling all over the place. They're going to not be able to stand up. But she was forcing them to stand up. Lucas was bleeding profusely out of his penis, and she was still making them stand up. They were screaming at him, please stop, but no one did, no one cared. His own family. Ugh. They eventually took Christopher to another room. They put earplugs in and earmuffs on to drown out his brother's screams. And that was when they just focused everything on Lucas. Christopher had been mutilated. He was whipped at least 50 times in the genital area alone. So I can't even imagine how many more times he'd actually been whipped over these hours. That was just in his groin area. His organs had actually begun shutting down because of this brutal battering. As I said, it was likened to a victim that had been pinned under a car for hours. Lucas was left in the corner of the sanctuary, bleeding profusely. As I said, I've shown you a picture, it soaked all down his pants. He was falling all over the place. He was kind of mumbling to himself, just incoherently, really. All the while, the people who hadn't been involved in the beatings were all just stood there and they were chanting 3 words. Those 3 words were, "You're gonna die." And then he does. He loses his life in that horrible church that day. When Christopher saw his brother lying motionless on the floor, he approached to he tried to do CPR, but he stopped when he realised that Lucas was no longer alive. Eventually, his family took him to the hospital 12 hours later, when his body had already begun decomposing. So these cult members brutally attacked these 2 innocent young boys, one of them to death. And his own family took part in it, with his sister probably doing sort of the vital blow. She made him lose the most amount of blood. And it's just horrendous and horrific. And looking into this case, it's just awful. Christopher Leonard began testifying in court on the 21st of October. Let me just say as well, the authorities do actually believe that they think the torture wasn't because they believed they had these demons inside of them. That it was instead because Lucas wanted to leave the church. He wanted to go out, live his life outside, like anyone should have the choice to do, and they took his life for that. Whether that's the case, I obviously don't know, but that's what the authorities believe. Deborah Leonard, who was 59 at the time, and 8 other people were charged in the hours-long beating of the 2 brothers during the counselling session. Deborah Leonard pleaded guilty in December of 2015 to first-degree assault and second-degree assault for her role in her older son's death and her younger son's severe beating. I'm going to put a picture up now of where the other church members are, according to state inmate logs. There was also a book written about this case. A lot of information in this video has come from that book. It's called Without a Prayer by author Susan Ashline, and it obviously goes into so much more detail about the case. So I would advise you to check out the book if you really want to. She proper delved into it and went into searching into people's confessions and putting it all together and things like that. So if you want to buy that, then please do so. The following information was taken from the Susan Ashline website on where these cult members are now. As I said, this happened in 2015, so it's just a little insight as to where they're at now. This case was so shocking. These boys were literally beaten to death, in Lucas's case at least, by their own family. Sadly, Lucas lost his life that day. He was 19. He was so young, and if it is the case that he did want to leave the church and go and live out his life, he never got that opportunity, and it's just so sad. And Christopher, he was badly beaten by his family. He lost his brother, and he lost all of his family because obviously they went to jail. He ended up going into foster care, but he was lucky to not lose his life. Maybe if authorities didn't actually sort of act as quickly as they did and have the incentive to search this church, maybe he would have. Maybe he would have lost his life along with Lucas that day. I'm so glad that he did get out alive, but it also makes me really sad that Lucas didn't. Christopher carried on with his life, like we all have to. He graduated from school, he attended college. I just hope that one day he is able to lead a typical life after all that he has suffered. But yeah, if you guys have any more suggestions, let me know, I'll look into them for you. Give me a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you enjoy this content or if you like this video. Anyway guys, that's all I have today on the case of Lucas and Christopher Leonard. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.